Well, good afternoon. I'm Phil Strauss with FEMA Region 4, the Southeast Region, and private sector liaison. I also have two counterparts from FEMA with me as well. I know that Tim Cole is in the room. Tim, if you would stand up. And also Ron Robbins, who is supposed to be in the room. I think he's coming in shortly, but he's our National Business Emergency Operations Coordinator. The thing about the three of us is we're all three bald guys. And so if you're looking for FEMA in the room, just say, where's that bald guy in the jacket? And you're probably going to be like 90% sure you're going to get a FEMA guy. So I don't know what's going on, but you don't have to have that on your resume to get a job with FEMA. It's just one of those unique things here at this summit. But it's a pleasure to be here. We appreciate the partnership with Florida Division of Emergency Management and all of our partners, both public sector across the Southeast as well as in the private sector. Private sector really makes things run on a daily basis. Oh, there's Ron. And so there you go. You get the full complement, the trio. We're actually going to be on the road doing a tour. We're going to start a band and 3 banjos. So oh, okay. But we're going to be called the Bald Bureaucrats. So, but back to my point of looking at what we have for this panel subject this afternoon for the next 50 minutes or so, resiliency, and looking at what makes, if we're going to drive towards resiliency, sustainability in our communities, how do we get that to work in partnership in the public sector with the private sector? Again, doing the movement of daily goods and services are driven by the private sector. 90% or so of everything that goes on in Tampa, everything that goes on in Miami, everything that goes on in Pensacola and Tallahassee is driven by the private sector. Communities were developed and grew out of corridors along rivers or in ports or strategic locations in the valley or so forth because there was a commercial entity, a drive to develop something there, and then of course a community develops out of that. The government just doesn't say, pluck, we're going to do a community here. No, it's driven by and created by the private sector. So when we think of that, in not only building something, but making it resilient to things that are going to happen in the future, that's what I want to turn over to this panel this afternoon, looking at the ways that both the public and private sector can collaborate to build, now that we have a community, build that resilient community. And so with that, I turn it over to the panel for first thoughts.
Nobody wants
All right.
I've got one. Oh.
So I was talking about that band, our first song we're going to do. Oh.
Dave Andrews with Adjusters International. I think from the public sector, we can actually learn a lot from our private sector folks when it comes to resiliency, sustainability, because that affects their bottom line. They do it every day. If they're not thinking about that, the impacts of a disaster, it doesn't even have to be a disaster, a fire in a warehouse or a power outage that lasts too long or whatever the case may be, it affects their bottom line. So they're always constantly looking at ways. When I was with Alaska, when I was trying to write our framework, our recovery framework for the state of Alaska, I Googled recovery plans. The only ones you could find on there were business continuity plans. So I think there's a lot that we could learn from them and of what that means and how to incorporate mitigation, resiliency, and sustainability, all of those 3 key ingredients that you see in the National Disaster Recovery Framework and the very few frameworks that states have developed when it comes to recovery. So I think there's a lot there on the business side that we can replicate and take from when we're developing things in the public sector.
I would just chime in because I believe that resilience is very broad. And are we talking about the resilience of the business or are we talking about the resilience of the community and how they link together? Or are we just talking about the community? It's a socioeconomic issue. Really, you've got to look at the cultural differences that are within your communities. You need to look at the educational differences that exist throughout your communities. You need to look at access to healthcare, access to jobs, access to education, access to resources, whether that be social capital, whether it be tangible goods, who can get it and who can't. If you're not addressing those issues, then you're going to have differences in recovery because just saying get a plan is not enough when some folks can't get a meal, right? So you've got to balance that and say, how do we address the lower level issues? We know that there are some folks that can get a plan. They can do that. We're not worried about those. We have to address those that can't get a plan.
And that goes to the point of when you're looking at resiliency, what are your threats? What are the areas in your community that are the most vulnerable? What are going to be your breaking points right away across all types of disasters? And what are your threats? Where are you in the state? And what are your all hazards approaches and your perspectives?
Good afternoon, Steve Woodard from Jacksonville. We're also one of the 100 resilient cities as designated by the Rockefeller Foundation. And I've got to talk tomorrow, so I don't want to use all my material now. However, I think it is important. I was speaking to Brian before we started the session. I think I've counted that we've used probably the word resilience or resiliency probably 60 or 70 times already today, and I'm not sure that we really have a good definition or a good understanding of what that means. And Paul, I think you made some good points already. The official definition that the 100 resilient cities use, and this relates, I should probably caveat that it's really urban resilience, city resilience that we're talking about. And that's defined as the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems within a city to survive, adapt, and grow no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. So I think we're on the right track, but also important maybe at this juncture to maybe expand the definition of what we think of as resilience and taking a whole community approach, understanding that it really is based in part on those chronic stresses and shocks, and particularly as they relate to the poor and most vulnerable in our communities. The rest tomorrow.
Tom?
Phil, let me help you out here. There are a couple of points here when you talk about resiliency. First of all, resiliency typically has a large price tag associated with it. And in the tough economic climate, we don't always have that funding available. You know, when you look back at Project Impact and some of the other things that are going on, or strengthening infrastructure, you know, that took a lot of resources. From the wireless side, I'll give you this example, is when we have disasters and you know, quick onslaught disasters like the earthquake in Virginia a couple of years ago. You know, people try to get on the phone, they can't make a call. Well, I'll tell you what, we don't build out the network for 100% usage 100% of the time. It's too expensive. So thinking about that, you know, resiliency is also about the ability to respond. I know I can't build out a 100% network all the time, but I know I can respond very quickly when I do have an issue. Okay, because we practice that. We have our own disaster teams. You know, we do exercises every year. We do real disasters that we respond to and then do a post-mortem. So we're always learning on how to respond better, how to do it, you know, faster, and getting people back in whole. So you can't always do everything before the event, but I think if we plan and practice enough, we can respond much faster after the event. And then the other thought is, as we were talking about private partnerships, if I know what the private sector can do for me, and if I can get businesses to help businesses get back into business, that's going to help the recovery, which is really part of your resilience.
Right.
I'd just like to make a point here about our staff that in the workplace. They're part of the community, and from Red Cross standpoint, community disaster education, personal preparedness, family preparedness, that's steady state all the time, community education from first aid, CPR, all that stuff adds up to a personal confidence in what an individual can do. I've seen responses, not to kind of single out any communities, but I've seen a single response, the same one, with a low economic kind of a community having basically zero requests of emergency management. And another community in the same response, less of an impact, having much more requests to emergency response and emergency management, to the point where at some point outreach to Red Cross, can you give us some supplies because our community is asking for this. They really were not impacted that bad, but their tolerance was much lower. And as soon as the lights went out, they were asking for help. And other communities, much more resilient. Some of them had community disaster education, some did not. Their expectations were different. So it's not just economics, it's something about, you know, cultural and their normal day-to-day ability to stand alone. But The NGOs have this type of training, and it's offered for the corporate partners, ready when the time comes, when we talked about resiliency. So when your staff cannot mobilize and work, but they're frustrated and they want to do something for their community, they can be the type of partner in Red Cross, for example. JetBlue is a sheltering partner of ours. They mobilize right away, they activate, and they become a shelter team. And one of them pointed out that said running a shelter is just like working in the airlines. People are stressed, they come up to the front gate, it's what we do. We handle that all the time.
That's a good point. Nick?
So, two thoughts. So I work for PricewaterhouseCoopers. We've got about 195,000 people worldwide, 35,000 people in the United States, and big businesses are impacted by events. Superstorm Sandy, we had 11,000 people impacted who weren't able to work in the tri-state area alone, which is why we're actually engaged with this and working on it. I guess my comment is that there are no cookie-cutter solutions. You look at a big business like ours, which is impacted. You look at a mom-and-pop shop, obviously, you're not going to have the same solutions for both. You look at the city of Boston. So the city of Boston, as an example, had this big project called the Big Dig. They wanted to take all of their elevated roads and put them underground. And then a couple of years later, they realized, oops, we're a port city, rising sea levels. We've effectively put away all of our emergency evacuation routes are now in tunnels. And Boston is a city of communities. There are 147 languages spoken, and not everybody has an iPhone, not everybody goes to the web, and you really need to sort of look at the city and try and figure out how to go down to the basic level and engage with different communities.
So if I can add to exactly what you've just shared about your employees, talk about what Caesar's talked about with the community preparedness being such an important part. We're finding, my numbers could be way off, but we're finding we're pretty good in Florida at messaging. And you go to any media station in May, and they're all going to run their hurricane report. Everybody in Florida has heard the message, sorry, that's a Florida marketing, to get their plan together and be ready. And most people will tell you, yeah, I know I need to do that. What we're finding is that message is pretty well saturated that they know they're supposed to, but they don't necessarily take the action to do it. One of the things I like in businesses are similar. They know they need a continuity plan, but they also know they need some type of disaster plan. They all know it. It's the next step of doing it, whether it's cost effective or just labor intensive. They're just not necessarily doing it. So what are ways like Business Ready, something that we like to be incentivized, some way for us to be incentivized to actually make people take action. It doesn't always mean money. It may need that recognition. I know the Business Ready thing that Red Cross is doing is helping to get people incentivized to do that. And one of the things the Salvation Army is doing, and if you've heard me talk about that kiosk that's out there, pardon me for just a second, one of the things we think might help is by trying to find ways that integrate the private sector to incentivize or reward preparedness measures, and using children to get that message into their families. And the key of us, or the method that we're trying to do to accomplish that, is by working with private sector to use couponing to allow them to get a reward for actually good behavior by being disaster prepared. And hopefully in that message, and by giving them a coupon book that has disaster messaging in it as well, it's going to incentivize and encourage them to keep opening those books of disaster preparedness, to at least have it on the forefront of their mind that, oh yeah, I do need to do that. Not just in May, but I'm being re-energized every time I open that book or touch a tangible asset, whether I go to Kids Get a Plan and get a code to get a free McDonald's ice cream cone, or somebody's very sensitive to that, a free carrot stick or something that makes them, so it's healthy options. But the idea is, and we talk about business resilience, and when the Salvation Army does its training to small businesses, we use that 60-40 split and say, of this room, 40% of you as businesses will not be operational, and we will not as a community recover if you don't open. And if you can reward your employees by being prepared, have a preparedness awareness day where you bring your plan and share it with everybody else so that we know if you're going to evacuate or not evacuate. So we, for our 11,000 employees, have some type of an inventory at each of our branches that you're all going to go take care of your 90-year-old grandmother because that's what you're going to do. But you never shared that with me as your employer. So I was counting on you being there. You're only going to find that stuff out if you're asking the question of your employees and maybe incentivizing them to actually show you that they have a plan. And then as a community, how many of your businesses are doing that same, how are you awarding your businesses or rewarding your businesses for taking that action of seeing if their employees are resilient as well? And I think as a matter of that, human behavior is we like to be awarded or rewarded for good behavior. Well, then maybe we need to find ways to do that rewarding, whether it's coupons or certification with Business Ready that the American Red Cross is doing. I know IAEM is working on some of those type of strategies. Maybe that's how we get them more engaged. And we just have to keep doing it over and over to encourage them.
Okay?
I got a question.
Yeah.
Kevin actually said something that kind of been sitting here writing notes, but I think one of the things, as Steve and Brian and Tom have said, we've said resilient all morning long. We've said public-private partnerships all morning long. But I asked the group, or I challenged the panel, what are some of the roadblocks we're facing here? I mean, we come to this type of event. Obviously, we're all emergency management professionals. We're all, professionals within your private organizations. We come here, we high five, we go back to our respective organizations, and we get diverted due to economics, due to business, whatever that may be. Can we discuss some of the challenges in which we're facing to make our communities more resilient and improve those relationships? And how do we change those roadblocks? I mean, because I think a lot of us have all talked, we've all partnered together, we've all worked, and we all know our plans. But does the leadership within your organization, are they on board with it before that event happens? Of course, when the event happens, it's, how are we going to recover and what did you do wrong? How come you didn't plan accordingly? But how do we break those roadblocks? How do we break those roadblocks now to move forward?
Hey, John, I'll chime in real quickly. From a business perspective, the first thing that my CEO would ask is, well, maybe not Paul Riley, but my leadership would ask would be, what's in it for me? What's the cost? How do I benefit from it? And if they can't see the bottom dollar, if there's no incentive there, going back to what Kevin said, then there's no investment. There's no reason to go ahead and take that step. You have to kind of bridge that gap. You have to help them understand what the value is to the business. I think it's easier for the mom and pop shops to say, oh, I understand the importance of being prepared, because if I don't have insurance, then I won't recover. But it's harder for them, right? Whereas the big business says, I'm not worried about it. I think that we have enough infrastructure, we have the capacity, we have the capability to manage this on our own. If we have disaster recovery plans, if we have business continuity plans, and we've got some mechanism to go ahead and offset our loss, we're going to be fine. So, you got to get them at the table. You've got to get senior leadership at the table. We heard some of this conversation earlier this morning. It's with the C-level, it's with the corporate level, with the executives to sit there and say, I've got to develop that relationship at the highest level possible with the organization, and then you'll see them come to the table and really start to make a difference within the community.
Hey, Paul, this is Chris Summer, UPS. Let me try to elaborate a little bit on the points you're making as well. Is that, one of the challenges we have is, just as a general community, is there's different levels of risk acceptance. So the communities have specific risks they have to deal with, and they're willing to take on certain risks. Big business has the same challenges. Some things that we're big, we can afford a loss in a small area and deal with it. Other businesses are small, they lose that one or two locations, they're down and out. So there's such variance with risk acceptance across the business and community, and as well as the public sector. Each community has different risks they have to manage, and we don't know what all those are. So you have different groups, different leaderships managing to different risk acceptance levels. So it's not all the same, and that's it's really a big challenge when you look at it, from an entity perspective, the state of Florida or beyond the state of Florida.
And Chris, that's a good point. We're going to go to Director Kuhn next. Before I worked with FEMA, I worked for a Chamber of Commerce in Western Colorado. We had a lot of policy committees and so forth, and I'm looking at, when we talk about community resiliency, we have a lot of different, we have Fortune 500 companies, we have your small mom and pops, Main Street associations, and so forth. So looking at what the local leaders in the public sector, your city manager, your mayor, your city council, your board of supervisors, board of county commissioners, what are they doing with the county EMA, as well as then with the Chamber of Commerce, with your downtown area development district, with your economic development center? Really, then you have power in numbers as far as a small business, because then you're part of that chamber, you're part of a bigger group that really looks at the kind of the heartbeat of what that community is doing as far as resiliency or non-resiliency, looking at those threats that Chris mentioned. What are we doing with that? And so that thought, I'll turn it over to Director Kuhn, and then hopefully we can pursue what the city of Tampa would be doing, what a small rural town would be doing, and look at how they live and breathe.
Phil, this is going on with John and Paul said, my insurance company will reimburse me for gym membership, so they'll pay $100 a year for me to go to the gym. And that's based on numerical data that shows that by me going to the gym, I'm in better shape, so I'm going to have less claims. So they're going to make more money on me by paying the $100. They're actually making a profit. I don't know that such a study exists for preparedness type activities that a company would undertake. When I was with Walmart, and we would propose an hour of preparedness training, they'd do the quick math and say, okay, with turnover rate, that's $40 million a year. Why is it worth $40 million a year to the company to do that? And I didn't have any numbers to show them. But there certainly could be something to help justify that expenditure, showing if you do this, you're more likely to retain those employees, they'll come back to work, et cetera. But I don't know that that data exists today.
Nick.
Yeah, so I jotted down before, I get points every time I go to the dentist, go to the doctor, go work out, go running, whatever. And we have a total rewards program, and it turns out that I actually can contribute money to some charity that I'm engaged with. And I made a note that adding a disaster risk management component would be a great thing in our overall building awareness. Have you built your own family plan? Have you done something? Have you prepared for? I think one of the challenges for an organization like mine is that we were looking at innovative schemes to fund our contribution to RISE. So detailed to work on the project for 6 months, a year, whatever it is, but we're also making a financial contribution. And so one of the things that we thought was, why don't we just charge $1 per engagement that we're doing globally? It's about $2 million a year. We do about 2 million engagements across the globe. And so that was sort of our innovative way of financing our contribution to this. And yet the top management got it, and the people who were engaged in the project got it. But the challenge for us was simply just doing the nuts and bolts operational and getting that whole infrastructure in place to charge $1 per engagement. So we walked away from that idea because it was just too complicated and there was just not a mechanism in place.
And we're going to take a few more comments here, Betty or Rick, on what you have done in Tampa and South Florida. And then I want to throw it out there for the audience to kind of bring in some questions and some comments to kind of interject that into the discussion. So Betty or Rick?
In the Tampa Bay region, as well as the other 10 regions in the state of Florida in 2010, the state of Florida partnered with the regional planning councils, NOAA, and FEMA to update all of the evacuation studies for the entire state at the same time, which was quite unique, actually, in the history of evacuation planning. But one of the most challenging and probably the most disappointing thing for me professionally was that when we do our behavioral analysis, the people that we interview have no concept in terms of risk perception. Somebody mentioned risk assessment, and maybe that is probably heightened in the private sector perhaps, but in our communities, there is really a deficit in terms of the perception of risk. Our citizens are not aware of what flooding can do to their home or to their safety, and same with storm surge. They probably overestimate the wind. So we're getting responses in evacuations where we have evacuation zones that people are staying put, where it could literally threaten their lives and their families' lives. And then we have people, 40% of the people, depending on the intensity of the storm threat, that are leaving areas where they probably should shelter in place. So I think this risk perception is something that we need to deal with, not just from the public sector and our evacuation plans, but also from the private sector, because I'm not quite sure that the message is getting to the employees in terms of personal safety. And I think that is extremely important. Now, we have a lot of avenues and we have a lot of things that we could do strategically to address this issue. One of the things I learned this morning, and it's from David Andrews' dad. Thank you very much. He says, when you need a friend, it's too late to make one. And I wrote that down. Because we have a lot of partners in our community right now. And Meryl Lee was talking about our faith-based and our not-for-profits. And we really do need to rely on them and provide them with the resources they need so that they can help us when we need them.
I'll go to Rick and then down the line.
Rick Berman, South Florida Disaster Resiliency Coalition. One of the things that we found, we've had a tremendous success in working with the emergency management operations of the 4 counties that we deal with. And we've done okay with the larger organizations and corporations, but what we envisioned initially was having a good outreach program with the NGOs to kind of supplement the employee base of the larger organizations so that when we had a disaster, they could help with family-related issues and get the everyday people back to work so that the businesses were resilient. And that's been a weakness for us. And the other area that we've got is that there's a lot of complacency related to hurricanes nowadays. It's been close to 10 years, but we've found a lot of interest in other areas outside of hurricanes, specifically cybersecurity. We've done a couple of events on that got people engaged, which gets us the ability to talk to them about other matters. So we're utilizing, and we also did an event on pandemics this year just prior to the Ebola outbreak, which was timely. But we need to find a different way to reach them other than the same redundancy that we go back with hurricanes, because there's a tremendous amount of complacency out there. But from our perspective, we're looking for any assistance we can get to how we can reach the NGO base and the smaller and the faith-based organizations. The outreach of Salvation Army and Red Cross is pretty easy for us to reach to. But I think if we're going to have a resilient community, we really need to have those faith-based organizations and the small businesses, which are much harder to reach. The larger businesses, they're reaching out with us. They're working with us. They have those departments. We deal with risk management, we deal with business continuity, and we deal with facilities management. The one organizations that I see missing here, at least from my perspective, is healthcare and hospitals that are probably the most capable of all I've seen from a resiliency standpoint. Putting exercises together, being prepared, and it would be certainly good to see them involved in this organization as well.
Okay. Go then. Over to you, Steve.
Bringing this back to the insurance industry again, just to give you a frame of reference, when we talk about communities, communities are made up of businesses and individual homeowners or renters. In our state, we have about 6 million homeowners insurance policies, about 12 million auto policies. And back in 2005, there was a program called the My Safe Florida Home Program, and it gave incentives to people to harden their home, to put roofs on, to make them stronger, and those types of things. There's about 7 retrofits that we can do. And it had its fits and starts, but it kind of planted a seed to that idiotic little word called mitigation. No one knew what it meant. Some people thought it was a new coffee strand. Others thought it was a new clothing line. And so we've got to figure out a way. I think resiliency is a very strong word to incentivize people to make their homes stronger, to make these communities more resilient. The insurance industry has found a lovely way to do that in providing discounts or credits to those that put on new and strengthened roofs or shutters on their windows and that type of thing. Florida has done some dysfunctional things from a regulatory standpoint when it comes to mitigation. That's too long a story to share. But the bottom line is, insurance companies will reduce your premium as a homeowner and a policyholder when you strengthen your home. It's pretty simple. Insurance companies want to mitigate their risk, and they do that when people mitigate their risk. So a way to incentivize folks and to make communities more resilient, which is the topic of our panel, is to continue to spread the good news that there is an economic incentive to strengthen your home, notwithstanding sheltering in place and being able to stay in your home when the storm comes. Secondly, when you think about the return on investment when it comes to hardening your home, it's much, much more than just the economic side of things. I know we did some focus groups in the not too distant past where we were able to explain to people that the fact they can come back to their home after a disaster means it's priceless. I remember speaking to former Governor Jeb Bush about this, who was a real champion of mitigation and wind mitigation during his tenure, and he used to say that we had to continue to fight to get folks to realize that it's important to harden their homes, which makes communities more resilient. So, Betty, I appreciate what you're saying in terms of making individuals aware of the good things that mitigation and resiliency can do.
I think in the messaging then, we'll go to Steve next, is I know the businesses, when they look at relocating to an area, even from one state to another, they're going to look for a skilled workforce, what the education is as far as schools and academic institutions, tax incentives. So how can we market it as a resilient community? Because that might drive and pull more of the private sector into an area. And it'll be an incentive for those that are in the community, especially local officials, to say, how do we take that? Because if we're going to do tax incentives, what about looking at if we can market resiliency, even calling, and like you said, resiliency is it's a triple syllable word to a lot of people. Resiliency, right? What about stronger? Building something stronger, taking our terminology that we know and turning it into something simple that's understandable to the general public. Because if they just hear resiliency, don't know what it means, they're probably not going to go look it up in the dictionary. They're probably just going to press on. So that's another thing of how do we, with the end user in mind, because that's really where it's going to, if it's received well, then it's going to take root. Steve.
Yes, I'm Steve Martin. I'm a state floodplain manager in the state of Florida here. I work in the Bureau of Mitigation with Brian. I think the question about what the incentive for businesses is kind of self-fulfilling. Certainly businesses are dependent on communities that are resilient. And I wanted to take this theme a little bit closer to the boots on the ground level. We have an enhanced mitigation plan for the state of Florida, and our staff works really closely on local mitigation strategies. And that's all very well and good, and it points the communities in the right direction. And again, as I said earlier, the process of the planning is what really counts. But beyond that, what happens when a disaster strikes? We have impacts to communities, and we're scrambling to do something about it, get a handle on it. And we focus on the loss of buildings, both non-residential and residential structures that displace people. But I think mitigation of communities starts when you move in during, immediately after the recovery stage, where you get mitigators in there to figure out, well, what caused this damage actually? If we look at Escambia County this past year, there was some water retention areas that were overtopped and caused a cascading effect to where you had waters running downstream and eventually caused the collapse of a dam, which caused even more catastrophic disasters. So when we look at individual buildings, we see, yeah, they've been damaged by floodwaters, but what caused it actually? And so some of our staff that were deployed to DRCs would sit down and kind of a therapeutic aspect for some of the people who had great losses was to find out from them what the sources of their loss was, what was the source of the flooding. And it was really interesting because those people know their communities and they can point on a map to where the flooding started and how it affected them. I don't think it's that difficult for groups like the Florida Floodplain Managers Association to form what they're calling the flood response team. So there's a nonprofit organization that's trying to organize to help floodplain managers and emergency managers at the local level sweep in and find out how extensive the damage is and what the cause of the damage. I think that kind of group can sort of capture high water marks, which sort of helps define the more flood-prone areas. Certainly, we have to conduct substantial damage estimations for structures, and it sets the stage for mitigating those buildings down the road. And I think we kind of miss the opportunity to incorporate other outlier groups that are in the private sector, such as the engineers, civil engineers, and architects that can come in and assist to identify solutions to the effects of disasters. And perhaps the the business community can support that kind of an effort by financing the engineers and architects to go out and help communities figure out how to make their communities more flood resilient. We know that 25% or more of flood damage occurs in areas outside of special flood hazard areas. So truly these maps, these flood maps, are not perfect by any means. And lastly, of course, we've got a robust mitigation grants program that I think is not adequately taken advantage of by so many communities. And maybe there's an opportunity for, if administration of grants is such a difficult thing for some of these smaller communities, maybe there's a need for more grants administrators who can be paid for by a percentage of the grant award, especially if numerous properties are kind of cobbled together and a larger grant is given to communities to start the mitigation process.
Thank you, Steve.
Phil?
We're going to go. Yes.
If I can take a step back to a comment that was made by Lisa on the insurance discounts. It would be great to see some ability to be able to fund those mitigation expenses so that people actually can go ahead and get those discounts.
Got to wait for you to do it.
There is a program I know of called PACE, which is a national program, but it's implemented at the local level by municipalities. There is a Florida umbrella over it. I think, I don't know all the details of it, but there are programs that allow for financing of that kind of mitigation without actually becoming a loan. It goes based on tax assessments. So if we can get a little bit more information about, from the state level, how to make those municipalities participate and make themselves available to that funding, it's pretty substantial.
Okay.
I know there was over $500 million alone just in Miami-Dade County.
And Lisa, we'll get to you
I've got,
second.
I actually represent the Florida PACE funding agency, so you're speaking my language. And Clay County, for example, has adopted it, Nassau County, Flagler County, Gulf County, Walton County, and it takes 2 signatures by a county commission to adopt the Florida PACE funding agency, and there is $200 million in the bank right now to deploy across the state for wind mitigation and solar improvements. And you're right, you can roll the cost of that into your property tax. So I'm happy to talk with any of you about that, about getting your counties engaged, and that's pretty exciting stuff. I've been working with about 6 months, so I'm back in the mitigation resiliency world. Thank you for bringing that up.
We're going to go to Tom next, and as we do that, I want to make sure we open it after Tom's comment. And then as we're getting to the audience, I want the panel to think of some successful examples of partnerships as far as building resiliency in communities at the national, state, local level, and so we can capstone the end of the session with that. So as we go to the audience, I just want to say to Steve's point that FEMA, the state of Florida, and Santa Rosa County this past week did the High Water Mark Initiative showing from Ivan, correct? The storm surge. Mississippi is doing that after Katrina, so people can actually see that line and say, water actually got this high in this community. And that's a very telling sign, because it gets people to think. A flood map is hard to rationalize and visualize, but when you see water that came up to here, that's pretty telling. If we have the mics ready, Tom, go ahead.
Just, John, let me go back to your hurdles concern before. So 2 quick anecdotes. At Verizon, we make senior management part of the team. Right? So we have 45 crisis management teams around the country. Each one is headed up by a president or vice president of the area or region. So now they're responsible for making sure the recovery works well and that their team is ready. So they're part of the solution in that sense. Second one is, when I was at Office Depot, we used to have a hurricane fair. Once a year, we invited 30 vendors in, state, fire, police, insurance companies, ever-ready batteries, fire extinguishers. And we invited the employees to come down and check out all the vendors for everything they have and get them to engage with them to help prepare their own homes. Because if I can get the employee able to survive a disaster, they're coming back to work that much quicker. Because twice a year, I get called up to the executive suite, to all the executives, I had to give a presentation, our ready state before the hurricane season, and how did we do after hurricane season. So there are things you can do, and it could be very inexpensive to get this stuff done. Just have to have a little ingenuity and kind of think out of the box and say, look, we need to do it, let's get it done.
Okay. We have one over here.
Interesting topic. I'm hearing reactive techniques, reverse engineering where the damage was and then trying to correct. My sense is most government engineers have a proactive wish list. They know there's a risk. I lived in Wilkes-Barre. I saw them raise the levees after Agnes. We've seen in Katrina, and I know Okeechobee has a lot of risk issues. The Corps of Engineers is very active. I think as a matter of public policy, there should be more dollars allocated to communities so they can try to do the mitigation in advance of the disaster, and trying to get the public to be sensitized to the fact that it may be a little more expensive, but now you're taking a 200, 300, 500-year event, and you're trying to prevent all that damage going forward, so you don't have to wait for the disaster to prove the need, like the traffic light where the stop sign was after 4 or 5 fatalities.
Any other comments? Yes.
I want to talk to the understanding disaster risk point. I think Betty made a good point about it being perception, and a lot of the risk analysis and assessment is based on subjective judgment. It's kind of easy, I won't say it's terribly easy, but you can come up with a list of threats that may threaten your business or your community, but quantifying what the probability of that risk affecting you is, and also quantifying the impact, different levels of that risk, say a Cat 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hurricane would be on your facility, will help businesses sell mitigation concepts based on the level of risk something might impose on your operation to upper level management. And it's very difficult to find the kind of actuarial knowledge out there that the insurance company uses to make those kind of quantitative reports back to our upper level management.
Lisa.
That is why I am so excited about working with Brian and his team, because the tools, as I said earlier, the tools that the insurance industry uses have been used for, my insurance experts can tell me, you've been in the business how long, Bill? 30 years. Catastrophe models, that there's 4 in the world that estimate those losses with amazing accuracy. There's a tool called ClimateCast that will tell emergency managers within, every 2 hours where they should deploy their resources, much more accurate than the NOAA system. So, any of you that want to know about what is the insurance industry doing right, it's analytics. It's figuring out how to determine the risk and preparing for it and insuring for it and making sure their customers do it and have the insurance adequacy they need when the disaster strikes. So I just get so excited about building that bridge. When Sandy talked about the private side, talking to the public side, and connecting the two, I want to try to work very diligently with each of you on making sure that the insurance industry tools are there for you in a variety of ways.
We have others from the audience before we go back to the panel. Yes.
Just as we're talking about not only incentivizing but also removing barricades, sorry, Judy Wolf, Adjusters International. One of the thoughts that came to mind for me was post-Sandy, and this is speaking to FEMA in particular in this instance, but we mentioned state regulations as well. Can we make sure that our laws, regulations, policies don't get in the way of creative solutions around mitigation? So for instance, post-Sandy, one of the utilities was looking at, was one of the power authorities, was looking at some very creative opportunities to strengthen their system, make it more resilient against future disasters, but they were limited in terms of what they could actually do by some of the definitions of, like system-wide mitigation, et cetera. And that frustration wasn't just felt on the part of the authority, it was felt on the part of the FEMA representatives who were trying to stretch as much as they could to make that work. But if we can be sitting down at the table looking at how are these policies being formed and making sure that all the folks are at the table that need to be at the table and looking at what are communities going to need, how are these authorities going to need to respond, are there ways that we can fund these projects together and have a better idea of what they might be. That was just a place where the public sector could perhaps get out of the way of the private sector getting creative about the solutions that they come up with and are responded to as a community.
So I'm going to turn back to the panel. Those that haven't mentioned anything yet, spoken this hour, I'd like to get your thoughts on successful partnerships.
I was thinking earlier about, I wanted to go back briefly to the comment about NGOs, non-governmental organizations, faith-based organizations having a critical role in helping employees and families be able to get back to work. I believe, and I have for a long time, that literally every non-governmental organization and faith-based organization in a community, very grassroots level, becomes a disaster relief organization, whether they recognize that role for themselves pre-disaster or not. The down and dirty is that they're going to have to provide the same services possibly to a larger constituency, more people needing a service than ever before, possibly with fewer staff because some of their folks are survivors impacted. And so I think that it's crucial that when we figure out how to get buy-in from small businesses to do continuity planning, that we include the NGOs within the community, the faith-based organizations, the Alzheimer's Association, the homeless shelter, and all these folks to develop something that looks like a continuity plan, because without them, we don't recover.
And that's, Marilee, that's one of the key points as others think about their successful programs is in FEMA, especially after Katrina, now we have in each region an access or functional needs coordinator, disability integration coordinator. And the initial thinking was, well, we need to go out to the disabled community because they're going to need the most help. And in some ways that's true, but in other ways, the access and functional needs communities, depending what their need is, they have very innovative solutions that how they overcome obstacles every day and learn how to work through that as a community. And so we go there to not only say, okay, well, we're going to help you, but really FEMA's learning from them what they do on a daily basis, how that could be applied in a disaster, so we can build that into our plans. And that's one of the key things, and I'm going to use this as kind of a closing statement after the group that I'm just going to kind of put in here, saying we need to be collaborating in the planning phase, public to private, building the same plan, not having a private sector plan and a public plan. But before I get into detail on that, I'll turn it back over to the panel for what you've seen as a successful resiliency program, sir.
Well, before I'm going to answer the question I wanted to answer, not the question you asked, so I apologize for that. But I think the fundamental aspect of resilient communities is to have your citizens be able to withstand what should happen to them. If the citizen at the base level can obviously recover from a disaster or be safe post-disaster, then that citizen can get back to work, that citizen can get back to what he or she has to do. Your community just comes back faster if your citizens are able to weather the storm, weather the event, and then get back to their lives. How we do that? Well, we in emergency management try to do many different outreach events. We do expos, we do presentations, we do radio announcements, we do all kinds of things to reach out to that community. Yet it still comes back to what my predecessor told me when one storm came through, and a person called them up the day later. This is a hurricane came through. I called the day later and said, "Why didn't you tell me a hurricane was coming?" I mean, there's only so much that we can do. There is a personal responsibility issue that comes to our lowest common denominator too. So, there's that aspect of it, and we have to be prepared from our point of view, the emergency management, small e, small m community. That's all of us in this room, ladies and gentlemen. We have to be ready to respond to our communities when they need us. But again, it makes it a lot easier. Craig, if you get used to harping this all the time, they're survivors, they're not victims. They have to think of themselves as survivors, and they can get through the event instead of victims, something that's happened to them. So it's important as much as we can to get that word out and to have folks be able to be self-sufficient for that time frame. And I'm sorry I didn't answer your question.
No, that's fine. That's a good point.
Good question to have answered.
Yes.
I think if I could add one thing, when I was with Alaska as a state disaster recovery coordinator, we were focusing on one community, a very remote rural community, population less than 800. It wasn't catastrophic by any nature that meets the definition, but it was catastrophic to them. We did what we called recovery, long-term recovery, some would call it. I think one of the keys to success, and one thing I would hope folks would walk away with is engagement with the community. And we're talking about resiliency, and what does that mean? Is it resiliency at the business level, at the individual level, or is it the community? We were focusing on resiliency at the community level. Created a Galena Recovery Interagency team, which consisted of the business, private sector, included residents, it included the health sector, the local and tribal government, as well as the school district, because they played a major role within that community. But one of the things that we were looking at was, now that you've had this event, what were you already thinking about pre-event? Looking back at their hazard mitigation plan, looking at their comprehensive plan, their strategic community plans, et cetera. What are some of the things that they were already planning on doing anyhow? Couldn't afford, they didn't get the money, and now that we have this opportunity, can we incorporate some of those things, and what impacts are those going to have? And that's why it was good to have that interagency involvement across all sectors, because some of the things that the local government wanted to do might have impacts on the business sector, and with the business sector, some of the ideas that they had played a key role in decisions and how the government moved forward. So one of the single most lessons learned out of that event was pulling together that interagency group, getting representation from the various sectors across the board in that entire recovery planning process at the community level.
And then, sorry, I want to add to that, and then also pulling in outside resources, such as, I'm thinking of pulling in the university and the public, or the power authorities that weren't necessarily in Galena, but had the expertise that was needed to answer some of the questions that got raised through the community involvement. So
Great.
just really bringing it in, and that's where the public sector really plays a role, because they could reach out to the additional resources that were needed and pull them in.
And that's one of the key things of the public sector, is connecting the dots and getting those right dots. So yes, then we're going to do final comments with Nick.
I promise this is the last thing, but I wanted to say, you know how each political party has their talking points of the day or their talking points of the week? I would love for the Florida media to look at their talking points for the spring to find in every community the guy that spent $4,000 to put a Kohler or Generac generator in their house and took that risk after 2004 or 5, highlight that story, brag about them, and then go to Lewis Jones at Publix, talk about all of our Publix stores that have generators on them, make a big deal in those communities about people that took that risk that now 10 years later think that they may have made a bad decision. And that be the talking point for this spring, so we can praise those people that took those things to become resilient, rather than the anger they kind of feel that they've been 10 years without using that generator. So I think we could help with those talking points to help people become more resilient that way.
There you go. Nick.
Last year at Flash, I asked a question about affordability on resilience, where the X line and the Y line cross each other. And my question is, and I was kind of sneered at by the gentleman who was from a very large reinsurance company, who shall remain nameless, but if you're making $600,000 a year, resiliency is fine, so forth, and being able to meet the needs, but at $25,000 a year, I remember during Floyd, Chuck Hagan was at Floyd, that came at Florida and then turned and went all the way up to North Carolina. I know people who spent over $400 in fuel trying to escape South Florida, going up 95. Turns out they were going right near the storm. So where's the lady who's from the insurance company? Where do y'all meet as far as the X line, the Y line, with your risk managers of where, okay, in Florida, Central Florida, let's say a home is $120,000. What kind of winds are you expecting that home to withstand?
There's, and Lynn, you may have to help me with this. Each community, each area, there's the wind-borne debris region. Are you familiar with that map? And I often wonder where that came from, but it's been around forever. And it specifies what speed of wind is going to hit certain territories throughout our state. So I don't know what Orlando's wind speed is in the wind-borne debris region, but the insurance companies use data from past storms to determine the losses of future storms. It's all about the data. So I can't sit here and tell you that a home on Colonial Drive in Orlando is going to have this premium based on their wind risk. It is all about the data. I rely on companies like ER Assist, our good friend Laurel here, to help us with interpolating and interpreting that data. But what you're getting at is a lot of folks that are inland take offense to those that are on the coast, perhaps, and them there folks on the coast shouldn't be subsidized by them there folks that are inland. And there's a little bit of a war going on about that right now. But the good news is insurance premiums are going down. Because we haven't had storms in 10 years, Florida is the highest catastrophe risk in the world. We have that privilege and distinction, I guess. So rates are coming down. So that Orlando home is probably going to go down more so than perhaps a coastal home, if that helps you. But I can work with my good insurance company colleague with USAA, and we can get you a quote on that home if you give me some rest. And I don't represent a specific insurance company or sell for them. I just consult with them.
No, I guess my point is that where do the X line and the Y line, not from you insuring me, but we seemingly, sometimes I go to these things and I hear people talk about, well, we're going to build a 200-mile-an-hour home.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
How much does that home cost? And, you know, those building materials that are involved in it, are we talking about, it's again, I'm all for the resiliency idea. Don't get me wrong. I live on the Space Coast. I hang out with a bunch of engineers who took us to the moon and back. Yes, thank you, Gene Kranz. Failure's no option, right, Gene? But it's just where, I guess the thing that I'm always trying to find out and listening to people is I work with people day in and day out who only make maybe $50,000 a year,
Mm-hmm.
who cannot afford that $250,000 home. And it's where do we cross
I get
that
it.
line?
You and I'll have coffee after this great program. Thanks for bringing
Look
it
forward
up.
to it.
Okay, great.
Okay, final comments. We'll go to Nick real quick. Nick?
So I was just looking at the question, building resilient communities, understanding disaster risk, and trying to, building a little bit on Marilee's comment about NGOs and engaging with them. We did some work after Superstorm Sandy in the Far Rockaways. And one of the things that we observed was that some of the movements that sprang up using social media and things like Occupy Sandy, where they were new, they were there, they were able to actually share information right away about what was happening, get people assistance, etc. One of the things that we worked on was they couldn't get reimbursed for any of the work that they did. And one of the federal requirements at the time was that you had to have a 990 as a not-for-profit. And so we helped to introduce a little bit of language that basically said, if you're a new organization that is just rising at this point, and you don't have a 990 in place, it's okay. You can get reimbursed for the work that's being done. So I just wanted to put in a plug for saying that let's use technology, let's use innovation, let's use social media, and try and make sure that we're actually capturing those new communities that are coming up.
Right. Good, thank you. I'm going to capstone it with, since we're out of time, I was talking to Tom Sear before this, saying when we go back from this summit, instead of just repeating things every year, is now we have more information, we know people, and so the lingering things from this, the takeaways, I'd encourage everybody at the next break right now to get with the people, one-on-one, kind of look at where we can take things into the future, because now we know too much to go away and do nothing as public servants, as community leaders, as those in the corporate sector. So with that, we will take a 10-minute break, try to be back in here for 4:05. You do not want to miss the next section. They saved it for the end of the day because it's going to be pretty entertaining. You want to bring popcorn and peanuts into this next one. I'm just saying. So we'll see you at 4:05.